The Night Sky over Germany, March 10th, 1942. In the darkness below, families huddled in their homes, perhaps sharing a late dinner or listening to radio broadcasts promising victory. Above them, at 15,000 feet, something unprecedented was approaching, a sound they had never heard before. Not the familiar drone of the light bombers they had grown accustomed to, but a deeper, more ominous rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. German radar operators squinted at their screens in confusion. The signatures were massive, unlike anything in their recognition books. Flak gunners adjusted their cannons upward, straining to identify these mysterious aircraft cutting through their supposedly impenetrable defenses. They thought their fortress of anti-aircraft guns, searchlights, and night fighters would protect the fatherland forever. What they never imagined was that a flying fortress carrying 22,000 pounds of devastation was about to turn their darkest nights into living nightmares. For 3 long years, the Royal Air Force had been throwing everything they had at Hitler's war machine: Hamptons, Wellingtons, Whitleys, brave crews in inadequate aircraft facing impossible odds. Too many young men had never returned home, their light bombers no match for the sophisticated German defense network. The Luftwaffe's night fighters prowled like wolves, picking off British bombers with devastating efficiency. Flak towers bristled with 88mm guns that could tear an aircraft apart at 20,000 feet. Searchlight batteries created deadly cones of light that trapped bombers like moths to a flame. But on this cold March night, everything was about to change. The aircraft approaching German airspace was no ordinary bomber. It was the Avro Lancaster, a 4-engine monster powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, each one generating 1,280 horsepower. With its revolutionary 33-foot bomb bay and capacity to carry payloads that dwarfed anything previously imagined, this wasn't just an improvement over existing bombers. It was a complete paradigm shift in aerial warfare. If you've ever wondered how a single aircraft design could alter the entire course of a world war, how engineering brilliance could strike fear into the heart of the Nazi war machine, then buckle up for this incredible journey. Because the story of the Lancaster isn't just about metal, engines, and bombs. It's about the moment when the tide of history shifted forever, one thunderous night flight at a time. To understand why the Lancaster's arrival struck such terror into German hearts, we need to first appreciate the desperate situation facing RAF Bomber Command in those early war years. Picture young British aircrews, barely out of their teens, climbing into aircraft that were essentially flying coffins. The Handley Page Hampton, with its pitiful 4,000-pound bomb load, was so lightly defended that German night fighters picked them off like sitting ducks. The Vickers Wellington, despite its innovative geodetic construction, simply couldn't carry enough ordnance to make a meaningful dent in Germany's industrial heartland. These brave men faced odds that would have broken lesser spirits. On a typical night raid over the Ruhr Valley, squadrons would take off with 20 aircraft and return with 12, if they were lucky. The math was brutal and unforgiving. At that rate of attrition, bomber crews had virtually no chance of surviving a full tour of operations. Yet, they kept flying, kept believing that somehow, some way, they could break through Germany's defenses and bring the war home to Hitler's doorstep. Meanwhile, the Germans had constructed what they believed was an impenetrable aerial fortress around their homeland. Massive flak towers bristled with 88mm anti-aircraft guns that could hurl shells to altitudes of 35,000 feet. These weren't just defensive positions, they were monuments to German engineering pride, concrete behemoths that declared to the world that the Reich's skies were inviolable. Searchlight batteries created intersecting beams of death, illuminating Allied bombers like actors on a deadly stage. And prowling through the darkness came the Luftwaffe's night fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-110s and Junkers Ju-88s, equipped with radar and devastating firepower. The German radar network was equally formidable. Würzburg and Freya detection systems could spot incoming bombers hundreds of miles away, giving defense commanders plenty of time to coordinate their response. Fighter controllers would vector their aircraft toward the bomber streams with clinical precision, while flak batteries prepared to fill the sky with lethal shrapnel. To the German High Command, it seemed mathematically impossible for the Allies to sustain their bombing campaign. The losses were simply too heavy, the results too meager. But what the Germans didn't realize was that across the English Channel, a revolution was taking shape in the design halls of Avro and Company. The RAF desperately needed what they called a game changer, an aircraft that could carry massive bomb loads deep into enemy territory and actually survive to tell the tale. The technical requirements seemed almost impossible. Maximum payload, extended range, and most critically, the ability to fight back against the German death machine. The pressure was immense, coming directly from Winston Churchill himself and the relentless Arthur Bomber Harris, who demanded an aircraft capable of bringing the war home to German civilians in a way they'd never experienced. Then came the breakthrough that would reshape the entire conflict. When Roy Chadwick's design team unveiled their specifications for the Avro Lancaster, even seasoned RAF commanders could hardly believe what they were seeing. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 engines, each generating 1,280 horsepower, would power this aerial leviathan through hostile skies. With a wingspan stretching 102 feet and a length of 69 feet, this wasn't just a larger bomber, it was a flying weapons platform unlike anything the world had ever seen. But the real genius lay in the bomb bay design. At 33 feet long with no internal bulkheads, the Lancaster could accommodate virtually any weapon the RAF could devise. Standard configuration carried 14,000 pounds of high explosives, but in special missions, it could haul the massive 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb, a single weapon with more destructive power than entire squadrons of earlier bombers combined. This wasn't just an evolutionary improvement over existing aircraft. It was a complete reimagining of what strategic bombing could accomplish. The defensive armament told its own story of lethality. 8.303 Browning machine guns mounted in 3 powered turrets gave the Lancaster teeth that could bite back hard. The crew layout was revolutionary too. 7 highly trained specialists working in perfect coordination, each man's life depended on the other's skill and courage. Self-sealing fuel tanks and strategic armor plating meant that this bomber could absorb punishment that would have shredded its predecessors and still bring its crew home alive. Can you imagine the excitement in RAF circles when they realized what they had on their hands? Here was an aircraft that could carry more than twice the bomb load of a Wellington, fly deeper into enemy territory than any previous bomber, and actually fight its way through the German defenses. The numbers alone told the story. Where the Wellington struggled to carry 4,500 pounds of bombs, the Lancaster routinely hauled 14,000 pounds with the capability to carry even more on special missions. But statistics on paper are one thing. Combat performance is another entirely. The Lancaster's true test would come in the skies over Germany, where German gunners and fighter pilots waited with 3 years of experience in destroying British bombers. What happened next would send shockwaves through the highest levels of Nazi command and fundamentally alter the trajectory of World War II. The night of March 10, 1942, began like countless others for the German defenders. Radar operators settled into their routine monitoring shifts, flak crews performed their standard equipment checks, and Luftwaffe pilots dozed in their ready rooms, confident in their proven ability to intercept and destroy British bombers. The first indication that something was different came from the radar stations along the coast. The signatures appearing on their screens were larger than usual, but intelligence reports hadn't indicated any new British aircraft types entering service. When the first Lancaster formations crossed into German airspace, the response was initially routine. Flak batteries opened fire at the anticipated altitudes, searchlights swept the sky in familiar patterns, and night fighters scrambled to intercept what they assumed were more of the same vulnerable British bombers they'd been destroying for years. But within minutes, German commanders realized they were facing something entirely unprecedented. The Lancasters weren't where they were supposed to be. They flew higher than expected, maintained tighter formations than previous British bombers, and most unsettling of all, they seemed to shrug off damage that should have brought them down. Luftwaffe pilot reports began flooding in with descriptions that their superiors initially dismissed as combat stress or exaggeration. Diese Bomber sind anders, One veteran night fighter pilot radioed to his controller. Sie fliegen höher, tragen mehr und sie kämpfen zurück. These bombers are different. They fly higher, carry more, and they fight back. The flak gunners were equally bewildered. Shells that should have torn the British aircraft apart seemed to have minimal effect. The Lancasters absorbed direct hits that would have vaporized a Wellington or Hampton and continued flying straight and level toward their targets. Searchlight crews found it much harder to hold the new bombers in their beams. The aircraft seemed more stable, more resistant to the buffeting that usually made illuminated bombers easy prey for the night fighters. German ground observers reported something even more alarming. The sound was different. The deep rumbling roar of 4 Merlin engines was unlike anything they had heard before. Where previous British raids had produced a scattered, inconsistent drone as formations spread out under defensive pressure, the Lancasters maintained a steady, ominous thunder that seemed to shake buildings even at high altitude. The bombing results were immediately apparent and terrifying in their precision. Where earlier raids had scattered their limited payloads across wide areas with minimal effect, the Lancasters concentrated devastating firepower on specific targets. Industrial facilities that had weathered dozens of previous attacks were suddenly ablaze. Rail yards that had been quickly repaired after light damage were now twisted masses of steel and concrete that would take months to rebuild. But perhaps most unsettling for the German defenders was the psychological impact. Civilians who had grown accustomed to air raid sirens and brief interruptions to their daily routines now huddled in shelters as explosions shook the earth above them with unprecedented violence. The sound of approaching Lancasters became a harbinger of destruction on a scale they'd never experienced. One German civilian diary entry from that period captures the growing fear. The sound was different, deeper, more terrifying. We knew immediately that something had changed, that the war had come home to us in a way we never imagined possible. This was only the beginning. Lancaster sightings were about to become far more common and far more devastating as RAF Bomber Command prepared to unleash the full potential of their new aerial weapon against the heart of Nazi Germany. Your thoughts on this dramatic shift in aerial warfare? Can you imagine being on either side of this technological revolution? Share this video with anyone who appreciates how innovation can change the course of history. The Lancasters' true capabilities would be demonstrated not in isolated raids but in the massive bombing campaigns that followed. The first of these came on May 30th, 1942, when RAF Bomber Command launched Operation Millennium, the first 1,000-bomber raid in military history. The target was Cologne, one of Germany's most important industrial and transportation centers. Of the 1,047 aircraft that participated in this unprecedented assault, 73 were the new Lancasters, and their performance would prove decisive. Picture the scene from a German perspective. Air raid sirens wailing across Cologne as radio operators frantically tried to count the incoming aircraft. The numbers seemed impossible. Surely their equipment was malfunctioning. But as the night sky filled with the thunder of over 1,000 engines, the terrible reality became clear. This wasn't just another nuisance raid. This was industrial-scale destruction descending from the heavens. The Lancasters served as the spearhead of this massive formation, their heavy bomb loads concentrated on the most critical targets, while the lighter bombers spread destruction across the broader city area. By dawn on May 31st, over 600 acres of Cologne lay in ruins. 45,000 people had been rendered homeless in a single night. For the first time since the war began, a German city had been effectively erased from existence by Allied air power. The psychological impact rippled through German society like an earthquake. Civilians who had been told that the Reich's defenses were impregnable now saw irrefutable evidence that British bombers could strike at will, with devastating effect, deep inside German territory. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels scrambled to control the narrative, but the evidence of destruction was too widespread to hide. The myth of German invincibility in the air had been shattered by a single night's work. But if Cologne demonstrated the Lancasters' capacity for mass destruction, Operation Chastise would prove its precision and versatility in ways that defied imagination. On the night of May 16, 1943, 19 specially modified Lancaster Magdathurers took off from RAF Scampton on what would become known as the Dambusters raid. Led by Wing Commander Guy Gibson, 617 Squadron carried Barnes Wallace's revolutionary bouncing bomb, the upkeep weapon designed specifically to breach the massive concrete dams that powered Germany's industrial heartland. The technical challenges were staggering. Each Lancaster would have to fly at exactly 60 feet above the water, maintaining precise speed and altitude while racing toward heavily defended targets bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. Too high, and the bomb would shatter on impact. Too low, and the aircraft would be destroyed by the explosion of their own weapon. Gibson's own words capture the Lancaster's remarkable stability under these impossible conditions. The aircraft performed like a dream throughout the entire approach. Even at treetop level, with flak bursting all around us, she remained steady as a rock. I've never flown an aircraft that inspired such confidence in extreme conditions. The raid succeeded in breaching both the Möhne and Eder dams, causing massive flooding and industrial disruption throughout the Ruhr Valley. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Lancaster could serve not just as a strategic bomber, but as a precision instrument capable of surgical strikes against specific high-value targets. The German response was a mixture of admiration and terror. Luftwaffe commanders who examined the wreckage and interviewed survivors couldn't believe the conventional aircraft had accomplished such a feat. The precision required, the courage of the crews, and the devastating effectiveness of the attack forced a complete reassessment of British capabilities. One German intelligence report from this period noted, "The enemy has achieved what our experts considered impossible. We must assume that no target in the Reich is now beyond their reach, yet even these spectacular demonstrations paled beside what came next." In July 1943, RAF Bomber Command launched Operation Gomorrah, a series of coordinated attacks on Hamburg that would create the first man-made firestorm in human history. The Lancasters played a crucial role not just in delivering incendiary bombs, but in deploying window, strips of aluminum foil that completely blinded German radar systems. The results were apocalyptic. Temperatures in Hamburg reached 800 degrees Celsius as oxygen was sucked from the air to feed the flames. Winds of 120 miles per hour created by the fire's thermal dynamics turned the city into a literal hell on earth. When the smoke cleared, 37,000 civilians had perished and 280,000 buildings had been reduced to ash. Entire city blocks had been erased so completely that post-war reconstruction crews couldn't determine where streets had once run. These numbers might seem abstract until you consider their human dimension. Hamburg was home to families, children, elderly grandparents, people whose only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Lancaster crews themselves struggled with the moral weight of what they were accomplishing. Many later spoke of the internal conflict between their duty to end the war and their horror at the destruction they were witnessing. Yet they continued to fly, night after night, because they believed that breaking German morale and industrial capacity would ultimately save more lives than it cost. The German response to these escalating attacks revealed the true extent of the terror that Lancasters had introduced into their strategic calculations. The Luftwaffe was forced to completely restructure its defensive doctrine, pulling fighters from other fronts to defend the homeland. Flak gun production was increased from 2,600 to over 10,000 pieces, draining resources from other critical military programs. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were evacuated from major cities, disrupting industrial production and civilian morale. Most tellingly, the Germans began developing their Vergeltungswaffen, revenge weapons like the V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, in a desperate attempt to terrorize British civilians the way the Lancasters were terrorizing German cities. But these weapons, advanced as they were, could never match the sustained, systematic destruction that hundreds of Lancasters delivered night after night across the length and breadth of Germany. Can you imagine the psychological pressure on German civilians during this period? The sound of air raid sirens had become a nightly soundtrack to their lives, but now those sirens announced not just inconvenience, but potential annihilation. Share this incredible story of technological warfare with anyone who wants to understand how innovation can shift the balance of global conflict. As we'll see in our conclusion, the Lancaster's impact extended far beyond the immediate destruction it caused, fundamentally reshaping how the world thought about air power and strategic warfare for generations to come. When the last Lancaster touched down after VE Day, the numbers that defined its wartime service read like something from science fiction. In just 3.5 years of combat operations, 7,377 Lancasters had rolled off British production lines, a testament to wartime industrial capacity that staggers the imagination even today. These aircraft flew an astounding 156,000 sorties, dropping 608,612 tons of bombs on targets across Nazi-occupied Europe. To put that in perspective, the Lancaster force delivered more explosive power than all previous bombing campaigns combined, fundamentally rewriting the rulebook on what air power could accomplish. But behind these staggering statistics lies a human cost that we must never forget. 3,249 Lancasters were lost in combat, taking with them over 21,000 aircrew members, young men, most barely out of their teens, who paid the ultimate price for victory. Each number represents a family devastated, dreams cut short, futures that would never be. These weren't just statistics to be tallied in some military ledger. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers who climbed into those aircraft knowing full well they might never return home. Their sacrifice reminds us that technological superiority, no matter how decisive, always comes at a profound human cost. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain, for the Lancaster had accomplished something that changed warfare forever. It proved conclusively that air power could bring industrial nations to their knees, that the home front was no longer a safe sanctuary from the horrors of war. The strategic bombing doctrine that emerged from the Lancaster's success would influence military thinking for decades to come, leading directly to the development of even more powerful aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress and ultimately the strategic nuclear forces that defined the Cold War era. The engineering innovations pioneered in the Lancaster's design became the foundation for post-war aviation development. Its four-engine configuration, pressurized crew compartments, and massive payload capacity established templates that influenced everything from commercial airliners to modern military transports. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered the Lancaster through those dark nights over Germany would evolve into the jet engines that power aircraft to this day. Perhaps most importantly, the Lancaster became an enduring symbol of what democratic nations could accomplish when their survival was at stake. British industry, working around the clock under the constant threat of German bombing, had created an aircraft that not only matched but decisively surpassed anything the technologically advanced German war machine could produce. It demonstrated that innovation, determination, and industrial capacity could triumph over seemingly insurmountable odds. The Lancaster story teaches us that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in design studios, factories, and the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to surrender their freedom. It shows us how technological breakthroughs can shift the balance of global conflicts, but also reminds us of the moral complexities inherent in wielding such devastating power. What do you think about the role of innovation in determining the outcome of global conflicts? Do these numbers help you appreciate the scale of sacrifice our previous generations made for the freedoms we enjoy today? The Lancaster proved that air power could change history itself. If you want to explore more game-changing weapons that shaped World War II, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And vote in the comments below. Should our next video cover the B-29 Superfortress that ended the war in the Pacific, or the P-51 Mustang that gave the Allies air superiority over Europe? Your voice matters in keeping these incredible stories alive for future generations.